Welcome to this presentation, The Money System and Today's Crises. What changing our monetary system would mean as we struggle with a rigged economy. This presentation is co-sponsored by WILF's National Committee, Women, Money, and Democracy, and our ally, Alliance for Just Money, represented here by our friend Lucille Eckrich. Our presenter today is John Howell from Alliance for Just Money. John has a way of presenting complex issues and ideas in an approachable and accessible way with clarity. And as an associate professor emeritus of psychology at Ohio University, with a BA from Kalamazoo College and a PhD from UCLA, John's going to do an excellent job today. He serves on the board of the Athens County League of Women Voters, the Alliance for Just Money, the Ohio University Emeriti Association, and he's a general committee member of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, representing the Lake Erie yearly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. He also serves on the Legislative Action Committee of the Alliance for Just Money and is the recipient of many teaching awards. John is passionate about how changing our money system could help transform our world, and he's an excellent teacher and storyteller. Welcome, John. We're anxious to hear what you've got to say.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Beth. I hope I can live up to that wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I really thank you for this opportunity for re-recording it, because you're right, the recording that was done in Chicago was not very good. So I'm going to redo most of that that I presented in Chicago. But that presentation, folks, was in May of 2024. A lot of things have happened since then. There are a lot of changes we're living with since that time. And a lot of those changes are related to the money system and the allocation of resources. So I'm going to start a little bit differently than I started the presentation in Chicago, and then I'll move into that. So if I can share my screen, I will begin. So I will try to share. Okay. So this was the first slide of the presentation that I gave back in May of 2024. But what I want to point out is that what we have seen since that time is we have seen the extreme concentration of wealth take over the country and overrun democracy. So the question that arises in my mind is it possible to limit the concentration of power without limiting the concentration of wealth itself? The two go together. Wealth creates power, power creates wealth. So in the past, as Americans, we've almost worshiped wealth. We've held up people who have done very well in economically because they have made significant contributions to the country that we all benefit from. But the wealth we see concentrating today is not so much wealth that is a result of exceptional contributions to society at large, but as a result of processes that sometimes do just the opposite. That is to say, degrade our environment and threaten our habitation here on the earth. So instead of worshiping wealth, we must start thinking about limiting it. And that raises a difficult question. How do we balance this? We want to have a healthy freedom for individuals to innovate and prosper. And yet we have to balance this against the effects of those things on the health of society at large. And related questions are these. Well, it's the same question, essentially phrased in two different ways. So on a finite planet, can we really raise the standard of living for the poor without decreasing it for the wealthy? Can we increase consumption of resources and the production of waste by the poor without decreasing it by the wealthy? Well, these are difficult questions, but it brings us to looking at the question of, well, how does wealth concentrate? And what policies might be able to limit that? And I'm going to skip what wealth concentrates, how wealth concentrates. You all know a lot about that anyway. The marketplace does it and other things do it. But I'm going to address the question here of, well, what policies could limit wealth concentration? And anthropologists tell us that there were deliberate, intentional policies to do just that in the Bronze Age. This is work of Michael Hudson, this is work of David Graeber and others, that produced this phenomenon um, uh, of debt forgiveness that repeated itself, often every time a new ruler took over. In any one of the Mesopotamian cities, debts would be forgiven so that people could be free to go back to their land, to claim it, to take up their farming and so on. And debt forgiveness, as you know, got into Mosaic law. And the reason why it got into Mosaic law was for 60 years, the Jews were in fact in Babylon as captives. And they learned a lot when they were there, and they saw this debt forgiveness happening, and they brought it back, and it came into Mosaic law. And interestingly enough, usury laws also had the same origin and got into Mosaic law. The Jews saw what happens when interest is charged on loans. When interest is charged on loans, it provides an avenue for endless accumulation of wealth. So we had usury laws, and some of them still exist on the books in various states. They typically have been weakened by exceptions and so on. But usury laws are in existence, anti-usury laws, I should say. So what other policies might be available? Well, since most of the wealth concentration occurs generally in the marketplace, market regulation is important. Market regulation has always been important to establish a marketplace where you can depend on the measurements so you won't get cheated. These are parts of the regulation of marketplaces and so on. And marketplace regulation also includes antitrust legislation, which has not been enforced very effectively in recent decades. Another policy that can limit wealth concentration is the tax system itself. We saw very high taxes in the 50s, for instance, and high income taxes, high estate taxes, inheritance taxes, and that did help limit wealth concentration. But the third system that can limit wealth concentration is the monetary system. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. It's important in this wealth concentration because the monetary system could be designed to distribute wealth. And right now, the way it works is just the opposite. It concentrates wealth. So we're going to look at the role of the monetary system in this overall problem of wealth, of extreme wealth concentration that essentially prevents us from having a democracy. Well, let's look at the history of this monetary system that we have. How did we get here? And we'll just take a quick look. The American colonies pioneered the use of paper money, and it was created by the colonial governments, and it was economically absolutely essential for the growth of the economy of the colonies. But Ben Franklin went over to London. He explained to the British leaders why it was that the colonies were doing so well. And he explained, well, we have a money system in which we create the money that needs to be available for people to use it to become productive and have a healthy economy. And the British became very jealous of that and felt that they ought to benefit from the creation of money. It shouldn't be something that the colonies themselves should benefit from. So they suppressed the use of colonial paper by several parliamentary steps in this range of 1751 to 1764. And that, in Ben Franklin's accounting of it, caused the revolution because it caused essentially a depression in the colonies because they could no longer grow with the increased production of money. And money from Europe for the Spanish coins and the English coins were few and far between. Well, during the Revolution, the Continental Congress made the decision it had to create money, just like the colonies had done, to get through the Revolutionary War. Now, those Continentals, which were created by Congress, by the Continental Congress, did lose their value quite rapidly, but most of it was from British counterfeiting. There was a British ship that sat in the harbor in New York. The Brits held New York through the entire Revolutionary War. And that ship did nothing but it was a printing press for counterfeiting the Continentals. And then the British used these to buy supplies from the Americans to supply their troops to defeat the Americans. So that was a first experience with government creating money at a national level. Well, in 1777, the Articles of Confederation were adopted, and it allowed the states to print their own money. And they did, but it was sort of economic chaos that resulted because it made it very difficult to essentially have transactions occur across state lines because you had to do all this money changing and so on. And one of the reasons for the development of the Constitution was concern for the economy. We needed a centralized money system. So the Constitution came along, and the Constitution actually allows the federal government to coin money. That's what it gives Congress the right to do, to coin money. The Constitution also forbids the states from coining money and forbids the states from producing paper money. It doesn't say anything about whether Congress can create paper money or not. And that was because of a standoff between those states who had those states when they were during the Articles of Confederation and before when they were colonies. Some of the states did very well with paper money. Pennsylvania was certainly one of them. Other states created too much money, in part because they were busy fighting Indians and so on. But because they created too much money that exceeded the capacity of their economies to use it productively, those currencies fell in value. And so the representatives from those states saw this business paper money was a bad thing. And so they opposed putting it in the Constitution. In fact, they argued that the Constitution should specifically forbid the government, the new federal government, to produce paper money. But others, of course, wanted the federal government to create paper money. So it was a standoff, like happens in Congress. So in any case, because the government was only allowed to coin money, there was a big need that was unfulfilled in terms of the economy, the need for a medium of exchange, the need for paper money. So Alexander Hamilton made the proposal that we should have a bank that can produce paper money. That bank was to be modeled on the Bank of England, which essentially was a privately owned bank. Investors, wealthy people, made investments into that bank, and that money could be loaned to the government, for instance, and it could be loaned elsewhere. And the provision was that First United States banks could essentially create paper money by lending it. So that's, and the First United States Bank did that and provided much of the money that was involved in those early years of development. It was proposed by Hamilton. It was bitterly opposed. It was proposed by Hamilton and bitterly opposed by Jefferson and some by Madison as well, because Jefferson objected to this idea of this bank because he knew banks essentially concentrated wealth in the hands of the investors who owned the bank. And he didn't want to see that happen. But he didn't propose to Washington any other system. So the only system that was proposed was the one by Hamilton, and Washington accepted it. So paper money began as debt, and it had to be paid back with interest. So the first bank of the United States lasted only 20 years. It was given a 20-year charter. It was not renewed because people realized that the profits of this bank were all going to its owners, which were mostly wealthy Brits. And so people didn't want their money going to Britain, especially since we were looking into the teeth of another war with Britain, the War of 1812. So, but Madison was president at that time, and he had a problem. The problem was to get the money for that war. So he agreed to the existence of the second Bank of the United States. It existed between 1816 and 1836, and it was ended then by Jackson's veto in 1836. Well, during this period of time, a lot of banks popped up, chartered by the individual states. And they stepped in to create paper money by lending. So each bank would essentially create its own paper money with the name of that bank on the piece of paper. So we had a lot of different currencies that were essentially generated by these banks. Now we moved on to the Civil War era, and then President Lincoln ran into the problem of having enough money to fight a war. He went to New York and was offered loans from the Wall Street banks at 24 and 36% interest per year. He rejected those as simply unacceptable. It would bankrupt the country in no time. Went back to Congress, and they essentially generated then the second episode of money creation by the federal government. And these were the greenbacks that essentially got us through the Civil War. It was interesting, though. That act was 1862, and just 1 year later, there was another banking act passed. This was because of the influence of the banking industry that existed nationwide, but largely centered in New York, as it still is. Those bankers did not want to see the government creating money because it impinged upon their very lucrative business of creating money. So they got Congress to pass the National Currency Act, which in fact chartered banks to become national banks, to be able to lend paper money printed by the government. So all these banks would now be creating money by lending it, just like the first and second national banks had. But they would all, and other banks had, state banks had, but it would be now a uniform currency because all the paper money would be printed by the government. And that act also basically ended state bank printing of money. So anyway, this period, actually before the Civil War and after the Civil War, was a period of recurring recessions, booms and busts. So the busts are essentially recessions or depressions. They're all different names for the same thing. And then in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in order to stabilize the banking system, to minimize this business of booms and busts, which always hurt people most who were the poorest, who lost their jobs and so on, and didn't have resources to get through a depression. So it was intended, of course, to stabilize the banking system. It provided a backup bank for the commercial banks. But what happened after that? Well, we had the crash in 1929. The Federal Reserve Act didn't do what it was intended to do, namely to stabilize the banking system. Now, following the crash, during the 1930s, there were important pieces of legislation that were passed to alter how banking worked and altered how the Federal Reserve System itself worked. And those changes, including what you probably know as the Glass-Steagall Act, and the FDIC was created during that period of time, and that did help a lot. Now, here's an interesting figure that shows this the share of the top decile, let's say top 10% of the population, their income. So it's income inequality in the United States over this period of time from 1910 to 2010. So here's a little bump of the First World War. During the Roaring 20s, wealth concentration went up greatly. With 1929, it fell considerably right here. And through the 30s, it kind of held, but during this period of time, these laws were being changed to alter how the money system worked. And they had a dramatic effect along with the legislation that was passed to accommodate the fighting of the Second World War, rationing and so on. And so there we had a significant fall in income inequality, which held up through about 1970, 1980. And this was the period, of course, of backing off of government regulations. Let the market be free and so on. And what we see is that this has caused this enormous increase in wealth inequality. This follows it up only to 2000. There's a little fall. It was 2008. This is the dot-com bubble. It continued to rise over this time. This is only to 2010, so it continued to rise over the last 15 years as well. So now let's address the fundamentals of how the system works and a little bit about its consequences. So we all know about bills and coins. We use those every day, and we think of that as the money system. But the fact is that's not most of our money. Most of our money is account money, and you know that, because most of my money and most of your money is not in your pockets as coin and bills. It's in some kind of bank accounts or accounts in various places. So the picture doesn't really look like this. It looks a little bit more like this, with this tiny amount of money that's created here as coins and bills. And here's the big picture. And the most important thing is that all of this account money is created by banks as they make loans. Every time a loan is made, the money supply rises by that amount. Every time there's a repayment of a loan, the money supply falls by that amount. Actually, the government does create some money. It creates coins because that's what the Constitution allowed it to do. And it has created paper money at various points, like during the Civil War. But actually, the paper money today is yellow. It's printed by the government printing office. It is sold for the cost of printing to the Federal Reserve banks. So it doesn't become money. It's just pieces of paper in the government's hands. It becomes money in the hands of the Federal Reserve System, the banks. Okay, let me just pause here to see if there are any sort of comments and questions that anybody would like to raise at this time. Let me stop sharing for a moment. Are there any questions or points that people would make at this time?
You can raise your hand by hitting the react button, or you can just say stack and your name, and we'll call on you.
Cheryl has her hand up first.
Yes, Cheryl.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating history you've just given us. I'm still a little confused and not understanding this concept of money supply being created by loans. Can you go into that a bit more, please? Thank you.
Well, let me say this. You're not the first person who's had a hard time wrapping your mind around that. We think of money in our hands and our pocketbooks and not about this huge pool of account money. But the fact is, the way the accounting system works is that when credit is offered by a bank, that means money is given to somebody to use in the economy, to buy something, whether it's a house or a car or whatever. Now, you might think that that money therefore decreases the deposits in the bank, because where did it come from if it was loaned out? It would have to be taken from existing deposits. But you never lost anything from your account when your bank made a loan to somebody else. Because in fact, for each loan, the bank creates a new deposit. It creates the deposit that then provides the basis for the loan. So with every loan, the bank creates new money, okay? So the bank's balance sheet does not go down as a result of money leaving it, this loan money leaving it, because it has created new money. Does that help?
Somewhat, but my money in the beginning came from the salary that I was paid for doing work. So is that's how I got money into that bank, is through my payment of
Sure.
my salary. Is that part of the whole system then, everybody's salaries?
You know, what you have to understand is that you're absolutely right. And all of us get our money that way. Well, we don't just get our money. Have you ever taken out a loan from a bank? I have. That money was new money. And keep in mind that the money supply increases every year. And so you have to ask yourself the question, well, where does that money come from? And where that money comes from is this process of bank lending. Yes, you're using money from your salary just like I am to pay your bills, but new money comes in through this process of bank lending. Okay?
It's also in credit card debt. Every time you purchase something with a credit card, your bank is essentially creating new money that didn't exist before. And of course, they're able to create it because it's based on the debt. The debt for you is a liability, but for the bank, it's an asset.
Yeah, I see. Lee Stanfield, you got your hand up?
Yes. You were saying that the government doesn't print the money, it gives paper or the permission, whatever, to the reserve bank. And so who the Federal Reserve, are they the ones that decide how much money to print? Or does the government have a say in that? Or does anyone have a say in that other than these individual banks that you're talking about, which give out loans?
Well, the primary driver of the whole process is bank lending. Lending by banks throughout the country that you and I all go to. That is the primary determinant of the rate of new money creation. The Federal Reserve has a responsibility of making sure we have enough bills and coins in the system to buy things and do everything we do in the economy. So the Federal Reserve will ask the government to print so much money, and the Federal Reserve pays for those, but just at the cost of printing them. And so in the Federal Reserve Bank's hands, it first becomes money.
And so if the Federal Reserve determines how much to print based on what the individual banks tell it they need?
To a first approximation, that's true, but it's more complicated than that, because the Federal Reserve banks also have ways of creating money simply by buying corporate bonds, and that's a process of lending. So I don't want to talk further about those details. We could get tied up with that, but your questions are appropriate, and the basic answer is that the rate of money creation is largely determined by what individual banks are doing. The rate of their lending is somewhat regulated by Federal Reserve policies in terms of interest rates. And the Federal Reserve also has other means of creating money simply by lending directly into the economy by buying bonds. So, okay, well, oh, Howard, go ahead. Howard, I see your hand up. You're muted.
Maybe go on then, John.
Okay, let me go on. So let me go back to screen sharing and I'll move forward.
I have too many dogs barking. I can't talk now.
Okay. Okay, let's go to the slideshow. Okay, now let's continue. So what's the consequence of this fact that we've just tried to make clear, that our money is supplied by bank lending? Well, the algorithm of bank lending is they lend to people who have enough collateral to make it of little risk to the banks. In other words, banks lend money to people who already have money. This process concentrates wealth by a couple of different mechanisms. It concentrates wealth by the amazing fact that we are continually paying interest on all the money, that 95% of account money, on all the interest that's circulating in the economy. The banks are collecting annually an interest because they loaned it out at interest. So this is an enormous flow of money from the many to the few, from the borrowers to the lenders, from the general public into the financial establishment, into the banks. So that's the first way it concentrates wealth. Banking has always been a very profitable business, except, of course, in busts where bad things happen. The second way they concentrate wealth, and keep in mind that this lending just continues to roll the money over to maintain this flow of interest to the banks, because money is lent and then it's paid back, and then it's lent again and paid back. So it has this circulation that the banks essentially benefit from continuously. The fact that banks get to determine where the money goes because they determine who's going to get the loans has significant impact. It goes for lots of things. Some of the things that we really appreciate, all of us, some of the things that fewer people appreciate because it's available to fewer people. It doesn't go for public infrastructure like schools and healthcare. And it's interesting that the fact that the banks can do this sets industrial policy. They're lending big time to fossil fuels, not so much to renewable energy. Why is this particularly relevant now? It's always been relevant, but right now we have, as you know, escalating levels of debt, both in terms of the federal government. This is the federal debt, but personal individual debt is rising just like this is. So we are a debt-ridden society. Second thing that's happening is we have this introduction of privately issued digital currencies, Bitcoin, and thousands now of other privately issued coins. We have these financial derivatives that were developed largely since the 1990, when the Glass-Steagall Act was revoked. These financial derivatives have been characterized, I think this phrase was from Buffett, the investor. Derivatives are weapons of mass financial destruction. So these are some of the things that are threatening the current system. So the people in monetary reform, I think, have brought about an emerging realization among increasing numbers of analysts and people involved with this, that we need a transformation of the control of the money system from the private, for-profit, corporate banks into public, nonprofit government entities. We need to be able to use this resource of new money for a growing economy to be used in the public interest, not just for private use, mostly of the very wealthy. Government created money could provide essentials. Government already provides certain things as public utilities or roads. You don't have to pay tolls on most roads. You have to do it on some, but not all. The air transport system, public health systems. The list is long. So the provision of the necessity for an economy, namely a means of exchange, could be viewed as a public utility instead of being created privately. What? You say, trust this government with our money system? Are you crazy? I suspect some of you thought that as I was developing this. And it's a legitimate question. I have a concern about that too. But you have to consider the alternatives. We're deciding here between whether politicians should be able to control the money system, which sounds bad, or whether the bankers should control the money system. And that may be at least as equally bad. Now, in order to find this kind of information, what you see here, these are all essentially judgments that have been made against Wall Street banks for criminal activity, fraud. Well, you remember this one when Wells Fargo, this actually made the popular news. None of these others did because this mode of operation by Wall Street happens every day. It's not news. It's just their way of operating. So here's the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, illegal conduct during the pandemic in 2000. The decision was made in 2023. Another one made in 2023. Bank of America reporting false mortgage data. They're cheating. Okay. JP Morgan hit with, oops, I gotta go back. Sorry about this. JP Morgan hit with, I can't read this, what the amount is here, fines related to its surveillance program. 549 million in fines for Signal, WhatsApp, to evade regulators' reach. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, 65 million penalty against City National Bank in 2024. And look at this one. Five-count felon, JP Morgan Chase gets hit with another federal fine for 40 million derivative violations. It has to pay 37.5 cents per violation. The fine was big, 15 million, but that was only 0.04% of its net income for the year. These are all slaps on the wrist. They do not change behavior whatsoever. This is the way Wall Street banks operate. They operate criminally. And they don't get followed by the news because it's just what they do. When politicians do dreadfully scandalous things, it hits the news media because politicians are accountable to the public. We can vote for them. We don't get to vote for these people running the banks on Wall Street. So this place we're in, we want to have it done by an accountable government system or an unaccountable banking system to control the growth of the money supply. We would like our government to be accountable. We've got doubts about that right now, but the principle is there. And if we can survive this period of time and get back to our some degree of democracy, I think that the answer is clear about who should be running the money system. So that's the goal. Control of the money system should shift from these corporate banks to nonprofit government agencies. But there are precautions. The precautions are that any proposal for government creation of money has to show that it can avoid creating too much money, because that's what causes inflation that chews away the value, eats away the value of our currency. Secondly, any proposal for control, for government control of the system has to provide for some degree of decentralized distribution of money. I think we should be rightly skeptical of total centralized decision-making as to the distribution of new money. Okay, so that's an important issue. Now I'm going to talk about just two general proposals that are out there very quickly. And, and, uh, and these are central bank digital currency is one proposal. Now, this proposal was more popular about several years ago than it is now because it has been completely, essentially forbidden by legislation sponsored by the Trump administration. But central bank digital currency is basically the idea that the central banks, in our case, the Federal Reserve is our central bank, would essentially create money by lending it, okay? And it could lend that money directly to the government, so the government would be directing this flow of money. And this idea is basically summed up in these four statements. And I put a proviso here. Actually, there are a number of different versions of central bank digital currency. So this is one version of it, and I just offer this. You give some insight into how it might work. So the idea was that everybody should be able to have their bank account directly at the Federal Reserve, skip the banks. And that way, your checking account would have the safety of the Federal Reserve, unlike being in a bank like the Silicon Valley Bank, which collapsed back in 2023. But the Federal Reserve would be much more secure. So people would shift their accounts from commercial banks to the Fed. And because in the current accounting system, banks need deposits in order to be able to lend, the fact that accounts would shift, they would lose their deposits, and it would impair their ability to lend. So it would impair money creation by bank lending. So how do you fill in the gap? We got to have money created. Money needs to be created for a growing society. So the Fed could lend to the government for money creation to be handled in that way. So this is a way of having the government play a more central role in the control of the money system. So this is, once there are pros and cons or arguments about it, and it's going nowhere in the United States right now, although other countries are moving in this direction. I want to present to you the American Monetary Reform Act. This is a bill to go to Congress from the Monetary Alliance, from the Alliance for Just Money, of which I am a part, and Lucille is a part, and many of you here are also a part. So it's a bill to improve and stabilize the nation's economy by restoring Congress's power to create and regulate money, to issue debt-free paper and digital money. So, and it can be accessed through this, here's the website that goes directly to this act. And here's a summary of it. Basically what this act does is it specifies how the government will create money and introduce it into circulation. And it does so in a partly decentralized manner. And it does that by specifying that 25% of any new money will simply go to the states in order for them to use it on infrastructure. So that's the first thing that's done. And it ends creation of money, the official money, legal tender, by any other entities, including banks. It establishes a monetary authority in government purposed to prevent overissuance of money as an analytic organization that can analyze what the appropriate amount of money is for government to introduce without causing an erosion of the value of the currency. It provides for a secure payment system because under the American Monetary Reform Act, the payment systems, that is to say your checkbook and mine, okay, will now be held by financial companies, it could be banks, but held totally separately from their business of lending. So this is a separate operation, could be done by a company who does only that, okay? And that process then will be heavily monitored by the Treasury Department to make sure it's handled honestly. So the payment system is made secure, taken away from banks, like the bank that collapsed in California. And it specifies how banks now are to function to offer the opportunity for savings and investment opportunities to the public and to meet the borrowing needs of the public without engaging in money creation. Banks will lend, but they will lend just like you and I lend. You and I can lend money, but we don't create it when we lend. We take it out of our bank account or somewhere else. That's what banks will be doing under this new legislation of the American Monetary Reform Act. Okay, yeah, this is 2024. I should say 2025. Okay, oops. So let me try to bring this to conclusion. I just want to point out there's a lot of academic activity going into this business of rethinking control of the money system. Here are some three examples. And I point out that two of these authors, both legal people, this is happening in the legal profession, not so much in economics. And these are women who are taking the lead here. And so Omarova was in fact nominated by Biden to serve as the controller of the currency. So her ideas are accepted at high levels. Another person active in this field, Robert Hockett at Cornell University Law School. I put this here, and it's a little out of date now because back in 2022, the US government was thinking about moving toward central bank digital currency, but that's now been interrupted by the Trump administration. I want to just kind of bring us this to a close with this quote. The financialized economy helps to drive economic injustice, social society fragility, planetary scale crisis. Financial extraction is a source of expanding inequality, the force creating the growing desperation of the precariat. Precariat, an interesting word. I guess that includes most of us. Finance is also in the process of absorbing the natural world as a new asset class of ecosystems with the aim of creating trillions in new wealth for the privileged few. All of this is made possible and partially driven by the creation of money as debt by private corporate banks. So here's the system we got now. Banks make loans. Those loans come into the economy. We get the loans. Businesses get the loans. Government gets the loans. And the money then floats into circulation. Businesses pay us who work for businesses, and we buy things from the businesses, and we pay taxes, and the government provides some services to people in various ways, largely that are distributive, helping people through Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security and so on. And then money is returned to the banks as principal and also as interest. So the banks get more money back than they can put in. How can that possibly work? It can work only because the rate of lending stays faster than the rate of payments, of repayments of these loans. And in that way, the money supply continued to grow, even though the net effect is the banks are asking for more money back than they put into the circulation. The banks keep all the interest and they make good money on the interest. Okay, so under AMRA, this is what it would look like. The government would be spending money into circulation and just the things that it spends money on now, Medicare, Social Security, transportation, all of those things that we're dependent on. And so they would hire contractors to do these things. They would people work for the government, and that's the way money would come into the economy, and it would flow in the economy as it does now. It would go back to the government in the form of taxes. As long as the economy is growing, spending can exceed the rate of taxes because we need more money in the economy as the economy grows. So the goal of all of this is a just and sustainable society. And I want to come back to the fact that monetary reform is really important, but it's not the only thing. There are other things that need to be done. There are reforms of taxation that need to be done. There are other reforms about corporate law and the constraint, the grip, the death grip that the corporations have over our society at the present time. All these things need attention too. But the monetary system is vital. And so that's why we at the Alliance for Just Money focus on the change of the monetary system. And we work with others as allies who are trying to do these other things too, because they are important. So thank you very much for listening, for your attention. And I'm certainly open to any comments or questions that you would like to offer. Well, we have some hands up. Can we go to those hands? I see Lee Stansfield's hands up again. So go ahead, Lee.
Hi, thanks. First, would the new system, would there be any interest, or does it eliminate that?
The government will spend money into circulation. Now, the government presently lends some money. They're lending from housing and other things. Government lending is important. And under this system, the government can be involved in lending as well. They can set up a fund out of which lending occurs. But the setting up of the fund will involve new money creation. But the actual lending then will simply be the same kind of lending that you and I do. It will be out of a revolving fund. Now, banks will still operate as lenders for getting mortgages, for other things. They will not be creating money as they lend, but they will have to cover their costs, and they will do so by charging either fees or interest. So those details are not specified in this piece of legislation, so they will have to be worked out. So that's sort of the answer to the question. This does not mean that there will be no interest charged. Anybody who lends money, even a business who gives you extended credit, may want to charge you interest for that. That's up to them to do in the marketplace. But our money creation itself will no longer be linked to debt creation, that is to say, lending. Our money creation itself will be independent of that.
Okay. If I'm really interested in trying to get the city of Tucson to have a city-owned and operated bank. Because I think it would be a good way to keep our local money in the local, in this area. And it would go a long way towards us being able to do things like build a parallel system to TEP so that we could not have to have TEP, we could compete with them and instead eventually get everybody onto a city-owned electric grid where we could decide to go with renewables instead of the fossil fuels that TEP keeps using. So I'm really interested in knowing whether you or could you recommend someone to speak with the city mayor and council about establishing a city-owned bank.
I think that's a really good suggestion, Lee. I think public banking would be very helpful. Public banking would be helpful under the system we have now. Public banking would be good even with the kind of monetary reform that we propose. And the place to go for help with this is through the Public Banking Institute. Ellen Brown has written extensively on this. It's published. She has a wonderful website. And this business of public banks being able to do lending for public purposes with the profit from that going to public use is an excellent idea. And I certainly, personally, if there were a public bank here, I'd want to use it. So I applaud you for your work in that direction. Let's go to somebody else, Jamal Thomas.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My question is, if we were to transition to this new banking system, how exactly would the monetary authority control inflation and deflation? What will be the rules that they would be under to make sure that they don't have too much or too little money in supply?
Right, a good question. And that's an important part of monetary reform, is to be able to control adequately the increase in money supply so it does not become too much. So that's why the AMRA, that act that I talked about, incorporates a monetary authority. A monetary authority would have the capacity that the Federal Reserve has now, and so does the Treasury Department, as a matter of fact, to analyze quite fully what's going on in the economy, and to be able to caution the Congress, which would be making the doing the legislation which would essentially increase the money supply by spending it. So that process of having a high level authority, monetary authority within government, specifically to design to avoid that falling into that trap. It would be accountable. It would be public in terms of providing its information available to the public, so the public would know if the politicians are essentially ignoring this sound advice and causing problems. So yes, you're right. That's an important part of the kind of monetary reform that is proposed.
Then my second question would be, for a banking system that didn't want to have interest, would it be a good idea to look into places like Islamic banking or banks that specifically ban usury as a more of a template?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the Islamic banks do not charge interest. You're correct, but the fact is they charge fees. It turns out there's not a lot of difference. Any bank has got to cover its costs. It's got to find a way to cover its costs either by fees or charging interest on the loans. Those are the traditional ways. Islamic banks do it through fees. Our Western banking system has used interest instead of it. But the banking process then under EMRA would not be affecting the money supply. So no matter how much lending occurs by those banks, they will not be increasing the money supply because they will be using pre-existing money for those loans. That doesn't affect the money supply. Okay, next here, I think is Cricket Doyle.
Yes, I just wanted to say something that occurred to me earlier, and I don't know if it's accurate, but when Cheryl brought up the issue of, when the banks put out new money, and she has to put her paycheck in or whatever, as I do. But it seems to me that whole system was built not on, if I get a loan for a car, nobody's going to hand me a stack of bills. The company I buy the car from is going to trust that if they need money, I will give them, my loan document, whatever, and then they can go to the bank and get that money to buy more models or whatever. So it seems to me that there's a trust in here that in the way the system has worked, that you are saying and many others are saying, we're not really living up to that trust anymore. Or maybe we never were. Maybe it always was, well, trust me to get richer, if I have the bank. But is that part of what you were talking about, that there was some trust, or is it just imagination? Everybody believes it's there, but it's not really.
Well, any extension of credit implies trust, because once the company that's selling you a refrigerator on credit, you take the refrigerator and they trust that you're going to make the payments. When the bank makes a loan to you, they trust that you're going to make the payments. However, the entire monetary system is deeply ensconced in law. So there are ways to enforce this. So it doesn't have to just depend on trust. In small systems and community, there's lots of local currencies have developed over time. And some of these can have lending that occurs through credit exchange in this way. And it is based on trust because they don't have an enforcement system. So trust is involved with this, but the trust becomes enforced in our national systems of law and money. But you're right that credit always implies trust. Yeah, James Lee.
Yeah, thank you, John. That was an excellent presentation. I just had a couple possible clarifications and one other point. It's important for people to understand that when the banks lend money, it's purely a balance sheet transaction. In other words, all they do at the end of the day is they say, we have this asset, which is your promise to pay, and this liability, which is the money we're giving you. It doesn't affect how much money is in the bank in any way. And the other element of that is, as you said, you need an increasing money supply, but for a growing economy. But what people need to recognize is there's always more debt in the system than there is money. And I don't have a chart in front of me, but I've seen them where usually the total debt in the economy is about 25 to 30% more than the total money supply. And that's because of the interest that's due and accumulates over time. And one interesting other thing is somebody said, and it took me a while to figure it out, but I've come to endorse it, which is the only necessary reason for taxation is to control inflation. That might take you a while to get your head around, but the only necessary reason for taxation is to control inflation. And I go a step further and I say, taxation is the proper way to control inflation. When the Fed tries to use interest rates, it's like pushing a string. They can't really control what the banks do with their interest rates, but by taking money out of the system, and that's one reason in the 1950s and such, we had very little inflation because we had enough taxation to drive out the inflation. So just be interested in your reaction to that concept.
Well, I think taxation is a very important part of this whole thing. It's part of the picture of wealth concentration that I alluded to earlier, in the present system, what government does, it spends money, and the money it spends, it either has to borrow it or get it in taxes. Because it spends more than it gathers in taxes, it borrows a lot increasingly, and that's why the federal government, the federal debt has increased so much. In the case of monetary reform, the government would be, what you say is absolutely apt. There would be essentially money put into the system by the government through spending, and it would return to the government through a process of taxation. And those two things would have to be balanced in appropriate ways. Now, as I said, the spending can occur in greater velocity than the taxation if the economy is in fact growing, increasing in productivity and so on. So there can be an excess of spending over taxation rates. And that's important in this in the present circumstances. If you look down the road, and ask the question under this proposal, well, growth can't occur forever. We live on a finite planet. So what happens when essentially growth ceases? Then there's no excuse for new money. There's no, a matter of fact, new increase in the money supply, if we aren't growing, will cause inflation. So at that point, taxation would have to be balanced. That is to say, spending would have to be balanced by taxation. So you're right. Yeah, I agree with you fully.
There's some questions in the chat, John. Let me see if I can scroll down to them. Well, Matt Elston said when a loan is made, the bank credits the borrower's account without subtracting any money from anyone's account. This loan becomes an asset on the bank's balance sheet and a liability on the lender's balance sheet. And those two equal each other, but the money supply increases by the amount of the loan. This is what I was saying as well. And it's a huge myth that most people believe in, sort of the Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful World idea that banks have money in their safe that is what they use to lend out. And when that money's gone, they don't have any more money to lend out. But that's not at all how it works these days. They continue to lend and really don't even trust the reserves that are in their safe or depend on them. They create money instead by the click of a digital key on their computer that makes a loan so that the amount of the loan is regarded as an asset, money due them, the bank, and a liability, money that's expected or to be owed by you, the borrower. And that's how the majority of our money is created now, even though we still persist in thinking of it in that old way, that banks loan the money that they have on hand, and it's an actual transfer of cash from one account to another. They're actually creating money, and that created money is the basis of so much of our monetary reserves. Also, I think it was somebody in the chat who said that it seems that the banks use the wealth that they get from this to do things like invest in fossil fuel industries and purchase politicians and buy lobbyists and contribute to an economy and a society that is not at all what most of us hope that it will look like.
Bravo. I agree fully with all of that.
Matt actually is the next person with his hand up. I don't know if Mary Beth said everything you wanted to say, or you have a question, Matt.
No, the statement about lending creating money was more just a statement than a question. I guess my question, I really liked your analysis, John. I appreciate it all. And you alluded about, environmental consequences of our current system. Does your reform proposal incorporate any of the externalities that we have in our current system? So our current economic system has negative externalities like pollution, and then positive externalities when people do good things that are good for society, planting trees, just as one example. I think the monetary system has the potential to influence those activities. Does your proposal incorporate like negative and positive externalities at all?
Yeah, your point's well taken, Matt, in terms of the need for money to be available to do the things that we need to do as a nation. Now, the act itself allows for government creation of money. That's clear. The act has gone through several iterations. And there have been discussions among the people involved in this as to how specific the act ought to be in terms of specifying how the government should create its money. So, and most of the people involved with this feel that the government should use this opportunity for dealing with environmental issues and other aspects of infrastructure. In the last iteration of this act, we didn't list a lot of those things. And the reason for that, which you can question, but the reason for it was that to specify all those things made it sound like a sort of a democratic wish list, and it made it more of a problem to present to people who are more conservative in their orientation to things. And yet there are aspects of this money reform that conservatives can very much agree with. So that's why it's not specified. But the point is, it's enabled. So by having this transfer of money creation into the government hands, it can do those things that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Howard.
Got the dogs quiet for the moment. I was wanting to revisit a couple of the questions, a couple of times that people brought up, trying to understand how money is created as a loan. And I'm sure they've all experienced it. Can you go in to get a loan in a bank and they type some numbers into the computer, and that those numbers are going into your bank account, and that's electronic money. So most 97% of the money is electronic money that's being traded around through credit cards and checks and things like that. Only 3% of the money supply is in cash. Now, that's bills and coins, the physical representation of money. Money is basically the lawful agreement. And so the government prints and mints the currency, but they sell it to the banks. They don't issue it, they don't spend it, they just sell it to the banks. Now, the bills are sold to the banks at cost of production, which means that the banks get make a profit off of using that money. Now, when you go to withdraw cash from your account, it's electronic money that's being turned into cash so that you can, use cash. So the cash is for the bank's customers to withdraw when they need some cash. Now, the system, if it stops lending money, you run out of money. And so that's when we have a crisis. So for instance, if loan payments, which is, because when you pay your loan, those numbers come back down, the principal, because they only create the principal. The interest must come from another loan. So the principal goes down, but you still have to pay the interest. As that principal goes down, that's taking money out of the economy. Well, if loan payments, which is money destroyed, exceed loans being made, money created, then we have an economic crisis. But the banks can also create an economic crisis just by stopping lending. So what we propose is, with a public money system, basically that money system that we have is for profit for the banks, right? That's what the interest is, profit for the owners of those banks, the shareholders, right? But what we'd like to do is end that system and have the government issue money for what? Public care. So it's changing from a system of greed and personal gain to a system of public care. And another thing about that is that, oh shucks, I'm trying to remember everything. I appreciated the question about inflation too, because obviously the Fed tries to control inflation with interest rates, which is an inadequate tool because all that does is slow the amount of money coming in, doesn't take money out. And so taxing is the best way to control and fastest way to control inflation. And when government is creating the money, they will have power to do that because currently public policy is controlled by the financial industry. There was a Princeton study done a few years ago, Ben Page and others, and what they found was that the corporations, who are basically owned by the banks, and the financial industry, the biggest contributor in lobbying, control public policy through the using money. Basically, that's what they determined, that money was the main factor in public policy. It wasn't the public's interest. And so that system currently it is controlled by massive accumulations of money. And of course, the banks are in the best position for accumulating lots of money. Well, right now we have a situation where those shareholders who are part of what we call private equity firms are now buying up companies and housing and businesses everywhere. And what they do is, on a lot of them, is that they're borrowing money to buy those. And when they buy the company, they sell off that company's assets and transfer that loan to that company so that that company now owes the money that was used to buy them out. And that is a real terrible thing that's going on right now, and why you see these bankruptcies of big companies and stuff, even though they're still making money. They're still making a profit, and yet they're deep in debt. So we want to change that system, obviously, and from a system of greed to a system of care. And I've much more to say on that subject, but I think that's probably all I should say.
Well, thanks, Howard. You covered a lot of territory, and I certainly agree with what you've been saying. So thank you. So Lucille, you're next.
Yeah, just briefly, I wanted to reply to James's last point that he made, James Lee, I think it was, about that the proper way to control inflation is taxation. And I really appreciate how you answered that, John. I think it's apt in the sense that, if I understood correctly, you said that spending and taxation need to stay in balance, government spending. And that maybe makes my comment unnecessary, because for me, when James first said that the only purpose for taxation is to control inflation, in my estimation, the paying of the public servants that we elect to represent us and who do the actual work of public government, those public employees, not elected, but serving the public good, we need to be the ones who determine their pay scale and pay them. And so that is a purpose of taxation, I think. And there's some accountability built in with that. But the value of what you said, I think, James, of taxation as controlling inflation, there's another term, an old term for that, called demurrage, which is a way of and this author I'll put in the chat, Macmillan talks about it as a liquidity fee. That's a more maybe contemporary term, but it's when there is surplus money, excess money in circulation, and specifically in the hands and the checking accounts, the transaction accounts of people, a certain percentage over your average expenses, say over 18 months, could be taxed. And you can avoid that tax by lending your money or spending it or investing it. And so you avoid that tax, but the reason the tax is there is money is in surplus. And a second way, that in a just money system, the only purpose for, in my view, I don't know if John would agree, but of treasury bonds, because we don't need federal treasury bonds to borrow money to pay for the public good and pay for military, pay for Social Security or whatever, that public treasury bonds could be used as a way to park surplus money if in fact, you want to protect it. That's what a bank would do. But if you want to save at no or zero or very low interest, and that gets into other issues, but there are some other ways, and I think there is a valid place for taxation, limited to pay for the public good, which can also have money spent into circulation when the economy can afford it.
Can I
just-
reply to that?
Go ahead.
I think that maybe the small point that in what I call a sovereign money system, which is what we're talking about, all the salaries, expenses are paid with that sovereign money, with free money. There is no need to tax for any government expenditure. So the only necessary reason for taxation under that system is to control inflation. Now, the other exception is, as the great economist said, is tax what you don't want and don't tax what you do want. But sin taxes or excise taxes as another subject.
Yeah, well, let's leave that. That's an area that we would have to work on together for a while before we come to agreement on that. But let's leave that topic and go on to some other people here who would have questions or comments. So Cheryl?
Yes, a completely different topic now. The $33 trillion that our federal government owes, I believe a lot of that is owed to the Chinese government, the People's Democratic Republic of China. And currently our government is trying very hard to portray China as an enemy. And oh dear, they're going to get more nuclear weapons than they already have, and therefore we need more nuclear weapons. So how, which do you think is the greater threat? Is the greater threat that we owe trillions of dollars to the Chinese government, which they could call in, right? If they try to call that in, I think we'd suffer a great deal more than the fact that they're going to have more nuclear weapons than they still won't have more than we have. So how do you compare those two circumstances? Thank you.
Well, let me respond to that. I certainly think your question is a reasonable one. And there is a good deal of ownership of government bonds by China and even more so by Japan. And there is a big chunk of federal debt that's now simply owned by our own central bank. That is to say, during the period of 2008 and then in response to the pandemic, there was an enormous amount of support that went out to the economy, and all of that cost money. And it was the Federal Reserve that stepped in to increase its lending to the government. So if you look at the data from the Federal Reserve holding of Treasury bonds, it goes right up in parallel with government spending. So it's large. The increase in government debt in recent years is largely to the Federal Reserve, banks themselves. but it doesn't minimize your question about foreign policy in terms of the idea of portraying someone on whom we are dependent for borrowing as an enemy. It's a real problem. I agree.
Mhm.
Yeah, Mary Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, well, why don't we hear from Walt, because I spoke before, and then I'd like to close up after that, if it's okay. We're running out of time.
Right.
Walt?
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I'm with the Public Banking Institute. It's a pleasure to be here among brothers and sisters in the same general fight here. A couple of things I just wanted to mention for your review and edification, I suppose. I suppose many of you perhaps you don't listen much to Tucker Carlson. I know I have never made a habit of it myself, but there was a podcast which he did this past week, which I think you'll find very interesting, very insightful in terms of understanding how the money system and the banking regime works. With Professor Richard Werner, who is the author of Princes of the Yen, which was an extraordinary breakthrough in understanding about monetary policy and the role of central banks. But one of the things that, and I'll just leave you with this little note that, he says, when you look at the law, banks don't make loans and they don't take deposits. So when you look at the technicality of the legality about how banks operate, you can see that there's a breadth of mythology that surrounds our affiliation with it. So I wanted to mention that to you. If you'd like to see that interview, it's on YouTube. And just go to Tucker Carlson and ask for Richard Werner, and you'll see that performance or that interview. One other thing you might be interested in is the National Infrastructure Bank, yet another public bank application where there is now a National Infrastructure Bank coalition, which recreates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation of the 30s, in which you see a publicly supported, publicly owned bank generating the money needed to save America from the Depression, pay for World War II, build a tremendous amount of infrastructure. And now this National Infrastructure Bank proposal would raise $5 to $6 trillion without raising taxes in much of the same way that we've just been talking about, using Treasury credits. So that's, again, National Infrastructure, NIBcoalition.com will get you there. And of course, Public Banking Institute, publicinstitute.org. We'd love to help you in whatever your work and focus is on getting the banking system to serve the people. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Walt.
that, John. Yeah.
And thank you, John, for a great presentation. I just wanted to mention that another huge myth that people miss is that we think that the Federal Reserve Bank is a part of our federal government, and it's not. It's a group of private banks charged with overseeing our financial system. The people who sit on their board are commercial private bankers. Their major goal is, profiteering and wealth concentration, cloaked in this mantle of managing the country's money. And that's an important myth, I think, that we need to talk about and get people to understand that they are not a part of government. And the Alliance for Just Money, their AMRA Act, part of it calls for the return of responsibility for printing and managing our monetary system to the government through the U.S. Treasury, which is where it started. It's just a small factoid, but one that I think is important as we're talking about this and trying to normalize the conversation about changing the monetary system. Thanks everyone for attending today, for paying attention, for asking great questions. And I think the takeaway from this is that changing the monetary system could allow us to create an economy that works for everyone. And I urge you to contact the Alliance for Just Money or our Women, Money, and Democracy Committee at WILF to learn more, or the Public Banking Institute, which also has some really great videos and courses and classes. So thanks for being here today. We appreciate it very much. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.